The monitor flatlines at 1432. The resuscitation team counts compressions. Outside this room, in the corridor, the paperwork has already begun. Inside the skull, the question is not yet settled. In 2023, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences monitored 4 dying patients after life support was withdrawn. In 2 of them, as cardiac function deteriorated, the brain produced surges of gamma wave activity, high-frequency oscillations linked to attention, information integration, and conscious processing, not random discharge. Organized connectivity across regions, the pattern of a system briefly assembling, not collapsing. The official explanation moves fast. Hypoxia generates artifacts. The dying brain misfires. This is true, but it does not explain why the gamma surges showed elevated cross-regional connectivity, structure, not noise. Chaotic electrical decay does not organize itself. The AWARE-2 study ran for 8 years across 25 hospitals in the United States and United Kingdom. Of 567 in-hospital cardiac arrests, 53 patients survived to discharge. 28 were well enough to be interviewed. 11 reported memories or perceptions consistent with conscious experience during the arrest. 6 described something the researchers categorized separately from hallucinations, delusions, or dreams. A transcendent recalled experience of death, structured, sequential, and often evaluated in moral terms. EEG markers compatible with higher cognitive function appeared as late as 35 to 60 minutes into CPR. Mean cerebral oxygenation, at that point, 43%. These were brains under severe ischemia. The monitors confirmed it. The numbers confirmed it. And yet the signal was there. The standard rebuttal arrives on cue. Memory reconstruction, sedation effects, post-resuscitation disorientation. These explanations account for mechanism. They do not account for architecture. The 11 patients did not describe fragmented static. They described sequence, perspective, a review, which opens the first 2 theories on this list, that the last minutes inside a dying brain may not run on the same clock as the one mounted above the hospital bed, that what medicine measures in seconds may, in some cases, carry an interior weight that does not compress neatly into that interval, and that the life review, documented across centuries, cultures, and now clinical interviews, may not be a metaphor for anything. It may be an extreme state of memory access, emotional recall, and network disinhibition, produced by a brain the monitors had already begun to write off. Medicine calls what happens after cardiac arrest the dying process. The data inside that process has started asking a different question entirely. What if the last experience is not a black screen, but the longest room you have ever been in? The gamma surges are one anomaly. What follows is its mechanical opposite, and in some ways, harder to dismiss. In 2018, researchers at Charité Universitätsmedizin Berlin recorded electrical activity directly from the dying human cortex. Their subjects were patients with catastrophic brain injuries under comfort care, who had consented to cortical monitoring after terminal extubation. The recordings used electrode strips placed against the cortical surface. What they captured is called terminal spreading depolarization. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable electrochemical wave that moves through the cortex after critical energy failure. First comes non-spreading depression, the brain going electrically silent in place. Then, on average 3.9 minutes after perfusion collapses, the wave begins. It travels between electrodes. It arrives somewhere between 13 and 266 seconds after the initial silence. It is not random electrical decay radiating outward. It is a propagating front moving through tissue. The standard phrase says the brain dies without oxygen. True. What the recordings add is the structure of that death. Not a simultaneous event, but a sequence with measurable intervals and a point of no return that is not the same moment across all regions. The researchers also noted that in experimental conditions, early anoxic depolarization, the opening stage of this cascade, can sometimes be partially reversed before it crosses into irreversible injury. The window is narrow. It is not clinically reliable, but it appears in the recorded data, which shifts the question, not whether the brain can survive without oxygen, but how long the corridor is between the last organized signal and the last moment that signal could have been called back. Then the data produces its opposite. Healthcare workers and family members have described something the literature now calls paradoxical lucidity, or terminal lucidity. Patients with advanced dementia, who had not recognized family members in months, who had lost sustained speech, suddenly speaking, recognizing, responding in the hours or days before death. The National Institute on Aging has supported formal research into this phenomenon. Reviews from 2024 confirm that evidence exists and is accumulating. The core problem is not whether it occurs. The problem is that it happens unpredictably, in palliative rooms with no electrode strips on the ceiling, at times no monitoring protocol anticipated. The cautious explanation offers projection and misinterpretation by those present. This accounts for some cases. It does not account for consistent, independent reports from trained clinicians across unconnected settings. The mechanism remains open. If neurodegeneration destroyed memory and personality, what returns in those final hours? If those networks were not destroyed but suppressed by inflammation, by inhibitory collapse, by the specific chemistry of dying, then the terminal interval is not a smooth descent. It is an irregular line, a depolarization wave moving through the cortex in one direction, and somewhere against it, a brief signal that by every prior measure should not be there. The brain, in its final hours, does not always agree on which way is down. 1 hour after cardiac arrest, the heart of a pig began to show electrical activity again. The team at Yale School of Medicine had not restarted it through conventional resuscitation. They had connected the body to a system called Organ X, a perfusion circuit that delivered a modified mixture of blood, synthetic hemoglobin, oxygen, electrolytes, and compounds designed to slow cellular breakdown. The experiment, published in Nature in 2022 and funded by the National Institutes of Health, ran for 6 hours after that first hour of complete circulatory arrest. At the end, they found preserved cellular architecture across the brain, heart, liver, and kidneys, glucose uptake in multiple organs, protein synthesis in the liver and brain, electrical activity and spontaneous contractions in the heart. There was no organized brain activity consistent with consciousness. The animal did not return, but the tissues had not simply stopped. They had continued, below the threshold of the self, running local programs that the absence of a central signal had not yet canceled. The phrase used in biological research for what comes next is genomically unstable. A 2021 study in Scientific Reports examined human post-mortem brain tissue at intervals from 0 to 24 hours after death. Neuronal gene expression dropped, but glial cells, astrocytes, and microglia, the brain's maintenance infrastructure, increased their activity. Some extended physical processes outward into surrounding tissue. This continued for at least 24 hours. The researchers called these zombie genes informally, because the name fits, not alive in any meaningful sense, but executing inherited instructions after the command structure that issued them is gone. The empire collapses. The provinces keep processing paperwork, which raises the question the third theory in this sequence refuses to answer neatly. If the body runs local processes after death, and the brain runs its own degradation timeline, what happens to the last experience that brain generates? The data here comes from a different kind of measurement. A 2022 Johns Hopkins survey study published in PLOS One collected responses from over 3,000 adults. Some had survived near-death experiences without drugs. Some had used psychedelics. Roughly 90% of both groups reported a lasting reduction in fear of death. Roughly 85% of the non-drug group and 75% of the psychedelic group described the experience as among the 5 most meaningful of their lives. A 2024 within-subject study compared people who had experienced both. Researchers from the University of Liège and Imperial College London found significant overlap in features. Unity, ego dissolution, altered sense of reality. They also found a distinction. Near-death experiences more frequently included a specific element absent from psychedelic states, a perceived border, a point of no return. The chemical explanation says, hypoxia, network disinhibition, endogenous compounds, the brain firing in patterns that mimic altered states. This is the most available answer. It explains mechanism. It does not explain why the experience of a border, a threshold, a line past which return felt uncertain or impossible, appears more consistently in people whose brains were actually in crisis than in people whose brains were chemically altered under controlled conditions. Biology dissolves the self slowly, from the outside in. The last thing it generates may be the most precisely structured experience a human mind produces. In 1957, a graduate student at Princeton named Hugh Everett submitted a thesis that the physics community received with polite discomfort. His central claim: the wave function never collapses. Every quantum event with multiple possible outcomes produces every outcome in separate, non-communicating branches of a universal wave function. What we call a measurement result is simply the branch we find ourselves in. The others are equally real, equally populated. Everett was trying to solve a technical problem in quantum mechanics. What followed him out of the physics literature was something he had not advertised, a question about death that has no clean answer. If every possible outcome is realized in some branch, then in any situation where you might die, there exists a branch where you do not. You cannot experience the branch where experience ends. By definition, any moment of awareness places you in a branch of survival. The observer who continues observing can only ever find themselves in the branches where observation was possible. For everyone around you, in their branches, you died. For the thread of first-person experience, death never arrives as an event, only as an increasingly narrow corridor of improbable survivals. This is not a theorem physicists endorse as a consequence of many worlds. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is careful to note that many worlds attempts to remove randomness and action at a distance from quantum mechanics, not to make promises about personal continuity. Quantum immortality is what happens when you apply the logic of subjective experience to a framework that was designed to describe physical states. The physics community calls it an untestable extrapolation. That is accurate. It is also insufficient as a dismissal, because the problem it exposes is real. Physics has no formal variable for the cessation of first-person experience. It can describe amplitudes and branches. It cannot describe what it means for a specific perspective to stop. The copy problem lands closer to ground. Philosophy of personal identity asks, what makes you the same person across time? The psychological continuity answer, the most common, says that what carries the self forward is memory, personality, and the connected chain of mental states. This works well enough for daily life. It breaks on the fission case. If future technology reconstructed your brain from a complete neural map, every memory, every pattern of response, every learned association, and did so twice, you would have two individuals, each with identical pasts, each convinced they are the original, each capable of recognizing your family and fearing their own death. Both cannot be numerically identical to one original, but neither has any internal evidence that distinguishes them from the real continuation of you. The technology does not need to be possible for the problem to be real. It only needs the logic to hold, and the logic holds. Psychological continuity, the most intuitive account of what survives death in any resurrection scenario, cannot guarantee that what returns is you rather than a being who simply has no way of knowing otherwise. This is the structure both theories share, not the promise of nothing, but the promise of something that may not be you experiencing it. The last theory is quieter than the others, and that makes it worse. The no-self argument does not need a hospital, a laboratory, or a physics textbook. It begins with something simpler and more unsettling. The feeling of being a single, stable person is not as solid as it seems. Thoughts arrive, sensations change, memory fills gaps, and the mind builds a continuous story out of pieces that never stop moving. The self in this view, is not a thing hidden inside the body. It is a pattern the body keeps repeating. That idea has a cold consequence. If there is no fixed self, then death does not destroy a permanent entity. It ends a process that was already unstable. What seems like a final loss may be only the end of a label we used for convenience. The appeal is obvious. It lowers the temperature of mortality. It says there is no little observer trapped inside the skull waiting to be erased. But the comfort lasts only a second. If the self is only a pattern, then every moment of identity is also a temporary arrangement. The person who read this sentence is already not the person who began it. This is why the theory feels less like comfort and more like a trap. It removes the nightmare of annihilation only by removing the witness who could be afraid of it. There is no one to die, because there was never a fixed owner of the life in the first place. That sounds clean until the human mind tries to live inside it. The practical question never disappears. If the self is a process, what exactly is preserved by memory, by continuity, by a body that keeps changing but still answers to the same name? Why does the loss of a parent feel like the disappearance of a person, not the interruption of a pattern? Why does the body mourn as if something singular has been taken away? The strongest versions of the no-self theory do not deny grief. They only say grief is aimed at a fiction of solidity. But that answer collides with lived experience. People do not mourn abstractions. They mourn a voice, a habit, a look, a way of opening a door, a hand that used to reach for a cup in the same tired motion every morning. The mind may be a process, but loss still feels like theft. And this is where the theory becomes most unsettling for the story of death. If there is no permanent self, then there is also no simple target for survival, no soul to save, no core to rescue from the dark. The question is no longer what happens after death. It becomes harder and more intimate. What exactly in you was ever going to remain the same long enough to cross that boundary at all? That is the final pressure point. The earlier theories asked whether something continues. This one asks whether there was ever a single thing there to continue. The final theory does not end with a funeral or a revelation. It ends with repetition. The eternal return nightmare is the oldest and most brutal of the possibilities, because it does not promise escape, resolution, or meaning. It suggests that existence may loop back on itself endlessly, not as a poetic cycle, but as a permanent recurrence of the same life, the same choices, the same fear, the same death. If the universe contains enough configurations, then even impossible arrangements can reappear. The same mind, the same body, the same room, the same final breath, again and again. This is not a documented fact. It is a philosophical extreme, a cosmic pressure test for the mind. But that is exactly why it belongs here. If the previous theories made death less simple, this one makes it impossible to place. There is no final exit if the pattern keeps returning. There is only the possibility that what feels like an ending is simply another turn through the same corridor. The terror of the idea is not only that suffering could repeat, it is that awareness could repeat with it. A life that resets without memory would leave no witness to compare the loops. A life that remembers would become its own prison. Either way, the comfort of a one-time existence disappears. There is no final silence, only the possibility that silence itself is part of the cycle. That is why the theory is so hard to dismiss emotionally, even when it has no laboratory proof. It does not ask whether death is followed by heaven or nothing. It asks whether time itself may be unable to finish the job, whether every escape route is only a delay, whether identity is trapped inside a structure that does not care what the person inside it wants. And after all the clinical data, the cortical waves, the zombie tissues, the quantum branches, and the copy problem, this final possibility lands with an almost primitive force, not because it is likely, because it is intolerable. The body fails, the brain fragments, the self dissolves into process, chemistry, and probability. But the nightmare here is not extinction. It is recurrence without mercy. The same life, preserved by the very structure that should have erased it. That is why the question never really ends where the heartbeat stops. It ends only when the mind is forced to face a stranger truth. Maybe the most frightening thing is not that death comes once. Maybe it is that it never learns how to leave.